And our word for today on this Wednesday of the first week in Lent, this Wednesday, February the 21st, our word for today is throne. Throne, our word for today. And here to talk about it, Deacon Dan Brahier. Good morning, Deacon Dan.
Top of the morning to you.
Morning, Dave. Good morning, Ron.
How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you. And I've got yet another jingle in my head. Sweet Car Online.
Yeah.
It's very good stuff.
It's no Fit Bunny, but it'll work.
Yeah.
Well, that's still a classic. Right? Yeah. I'm just so happy that it feels like spring. I mean, you know, it's hard to let go of winter because, you know, winter has its own charm. But I'll tell you, yesterday with the sun shining and in the 50s, I'm outside going for a run. And I'm like, my gosh, the world has come back to life again. So, and you know, that's kind of that's the whole idea of Lent. You know, this Lent is kind of a contraction of lengthened time. You know, and that's this time of year as the days get longer, and we start anticipating Easter, and we start looking forward to the resurrection and more light in our lives. It all fits together so well. So I guess that, you know, with an early Easter, maybe we can just have an early spring along with it.
Hey, man, I love it. You said you went out for a run yesterday, and I hate to say, I was so disappointed. I missed my run yesterday. That makes 947 days in a row. But, you know,
I went running
you can
yesterday.
run with me next time, Dave.
Yeah, there you go. It'll be a blast.
So our word for the day is throne. And, yeah, the book of Nineveh, very nice reflection, Dave, earlier. And it makes me think a lot about that book. The book of Jonah is kind of it's perplexing in some ways because some people think that it is a really happened exactly as it was written. Others say that it's purely a satire. It's a parable. Has nothing to do with anything that ever actually happened. What we were taught in formation is that there's a string or a thread of truth to it, that there was a preacher at that time that converted many people in Nineveh, and it was probably a fictional story. It's kind of one of those, you know, built on a true story or based on a true story kind of thing. But nonetheless, Jonah has a big task because you know, in this very short book, which is one of my favorites in the Bible, it's one that I've mentioned before, that I assign this to my RCIA group. And I tell them, I want you to have the experience of reading one book of the Bible from beginning to end, and I want you to read the book of Jonah. And it freaks them out at first. They're like, you want us to read a whole book and we got a week to do it? You know, but on a bad day, it will take you less than 15 minutes to read the book of Jonah. But there is so much that's going on in there. And so Jonah, in a nutshell, has been sent to Nineveh. Nineveh, we believe, had about 120,000 people living in it at the time. And God has simply sent him on the message, go, you know, on this mission, go to Nineveh and convert the people. It's kind of like, yeah, right. It's a 3-day walk through the city. And on the first day that he goes through Nineveh, the people repent. And it surprises him that all this happens. And more importantly, it's the king of Nineveh that is also repenting. And so the first reading tells us, it says that the king rose from his throne. He laid aside his robe, and he covered himself with sackcloth, sitting in ashes. You can only imagine what that would have looked like. You know, it's strange enough that all the people repented, but for the king himself to step down. And so that's why later in the gospel today, which is nicely linked with the first reading, Jesus refers to what he calls the sign of Jonah. And so both of those readings kind of parallel one another. In the book of Kings, we saw a queen, the Queen of Sheba, who rose from her throne to visit Solomon. And we actually just heard that reading, and I spoke about it a couple of weeks ago in that reading. We talked about how she crossed the Arabian desert on a camel for months. Literally, it took her 3 months to get there because she had heard of the great wisdom of Solomon. And so Jesus in the gospel today is going to make a reference to both of those stories. He talks about how Jonah was assigned to the Ninevites, and he says how the queen of the south came from the ends of the earth. That's the Queen of Sheba he's talking about, who came to visit Solomon. And so in this case, Jesus is citing two royal characters that both came down from their thrones, their places of leadership, in response to Jonah and to Solomon. But then he goes on to say that there is something greater here, in other words, himself, than Solomon or Jonah. And he wants them to realize that his throne is eternal. It's not temporal. It's not passing like a king or a queen. But if a king or a queen can rise for their thrones to visit other human beings, he's basically saying, how much more should we be humbling ourselves when Jesus himself is on the throne and in our midst? So if we flip all the way to the end of the Bible, go to the book of Revelation, chapter 4, John describes what the throne of God looks like because he was given a vision of that. And in chapter 21, it's where John says, the one who sat on the throne said, behold, I make all things new. And it goes on to say, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Now that is the ultimate throne of a king. Not a temporal king, not somebody on this planet who's eventually going to die and turn their leadership over to somebody else, but the eternal king in heaven. And so it made me think a little bit about how all of us have our own little thrones. You know, we may be the leader in our family, or maybe we're in a leadership position at work, or we're a committee chair, or we're on a committee at church, and we've got some kind of a, quote, power position there. Somewhere we all have our little thrones. And I think that what today's readings are doing is they're encouraging us to rise from our own thrones, to repent, to do penance, and listen to God who speaks from that eternal throne in heaven. And it's a good reminder to us that it's a time for humility and a time for salvation. And really, that's what Lent's all about.
I love it. And, you know, I've been convicted many times in my life, Deacon Dan, about how little it takes for me to create a kingdom. You know, with the dogs, I'll take anything and create a kingdom for myself out of it. We just have to be careful as we look at what the Lord has entrusted us with.
Yeah, we all have a tendency to do that as human beings. We just have to keep looking back to who is the real king, or who's really in charge.
I love it. Deacon Dan Brahier, thanks. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.